Right, now amid calls for protest at the outcome of Tanzania's presidential polls, police are taking a hard line against post-election demonstrations. They have reportedly made several arrests, including the leader of the main opposition. For more on this issue, we're now joined via Zoom by Advocate Pansy Tlakula. Thank you so much indeed, Advocate, for joining us, and welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much, and good evening to you and your viewers. Peter.
All right. I know that you're currently the chairperson of the Information Regulator of South Africa, but you wear a number of hats, and one that you were wearing this past week was as an election observer in Tanzania. What are your reflections about what you saw?
Yeah, let me say that I led the AISA International Observer Mission. I think, the elections on election day, I would say that at least where I was in Dar es Salaam, the election went ahead peacefully. I think the challenge in Tanzania is really with the constitutional arrangement that they have. The first problem is that one cannot challenge the outcome of the presidential election in court. I think that's the first problem that they have there. Secondly, most of the freedoms were curtailed in the run-up to the elections, including on election day. Freedom of expression, as you know, a number of media houses were closed down, and some journalists were arrested. So there was an atmosphere of fear from the media, and also, I think, self-censorship. I'll give you an example. On the day on which we released our preliminary report, which was on the 30th, the room was full of television cameras. The media was there in their numbers. But I did not see anything reported in the media about the statement that we released, because our statement was quite a balanced statement in the sense that we looked at what went well and also the challenges that were experienced during the elections.
As election observers, are you allowed to engage with the authorities to say, this is what we're seeing, we're concerned about this?
Yes, well, you know how the election observation works. Observers observe, and then they write a preliminary report, and then after that they submit a final report. But if one looked at the election, the guide for election observers, it had a very interesting clause that says that if observers notice any irregularities on election day, they must inform the Electoral Commission. We had a meeting with the Electoral Commission. I made them aware of that progressive clause in their code of conduct and requested for a number which we could call in the event we saw irregularities on voting day. They promised to give us the number, and of course we saw a few irregularities and we tried to contact them, but we were not given that number.
Take us through some of the irregularities that you might have observed. We hear that some polling stations had way too many ballots allocated to them.
You know what happens in an election, you start at a particular voting station, you visit a number of voting stations during the day, and when at the time of closing, you go back to the voting station where you started to observe the counting. So at the voting station where I observed the opening and the closing, I did realize that there were quite a number of ballots that were unused. I counted about 10 books of unused presidential ballots. I asked the presiding officer how many voters were registered at that voting station, and she indicated that it was 350, and only 85 people voted. which means that if a ballot, as she indicated, contained 50 ballot papers, she then used 1 3/4, of those ballots. So there was an oversupply of ballot papers. The turnout was quite low, at least where we observed. And what I also observed, which was quite interesting, there was no reconciliation of ballots. Normally at the beginning of the voting process, the presiding officer will then show the observers and the party agents to say these are the number of ballot papers that we received and record them. And at the close, they'll then do a reconciliation to say out of so many number of ballot papers that we received, we used so many and so many were not used. That reconciliation was not done, which I found quite interesting.
All right, so one of the things that we've heard in previous elections, I think the first time I heard it was with Zimbabwe, where election observers were asked, was it free and fair? And they said it was credible. Almost a second measure, because they couldn't quite give it a complete green light. What's your feeling about this election in terms of deciding on who won?
We did not make that determination at all, because we just pointed out, you can't judge an election by what happens on election day. You have to look at the totality of the whole process, whether there was freedom of association, freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom of information. I think from our observation, those rights were curtailed. The local civil society organizations that normally provided voter education in the past, most of them were not accredited to do voter education. Most of them were also not accredited to be national observers. On the day, a few days before the election, for instance, there was a directive that was issued by the Telecommunications Authority restricting bulk SMSs to 10. And on election day, the day before the elections and up to the day when I left, which was on Saturday, the internet was still not working. So you have to look at the totality of all that and say, was the atmosphere conducive to a free and fair election? Was the playing field level? I mean, if you're going to be having opposition members, leaders arrested and harassed, then there's a problem.
What it sounds like is that, that democracy perhaps didn't fully play out in these Tanzanian elections. This must be a concern for you as someone who's observed a number of elections and run your own here at home.
Yes, and more so that in 2015, I observed the elections in Tanzania. The elections that brought into power President Magufuli for the first time. I was in Tanzania, I observed in Arusha, and I was under the African Union. And the things were quite different from what I saw now. What I saw was just an atmosphere of fear, of hopelessness. I mean, we met the media, they told us, all the problems. We met the lawyers, they told us about the regulations which were passed hurriedly by the Electoral Commission, some of them which they thought were unconstitutional. And I said to them, if you think that these regulations are unconstitutional, why don't you challenge them in court? And even then, there was a sense of hopelessness to say, well, even if we go to court, we're not going to win. So you get a sense of people being afraid. It reminded me of the situation in Zimbabwe a number of years ago, where you got that sense that people feel that they feel that sense of helplessness. And that's the sense that I got. Really, from civil society organizations, from the media as well.
So what can regional bodies like the African Union, the East African Community do in circumstances such as this? Because clearly not all is well.
Well, the East African Community was there, and they said that the elections went well. That was their verdict. SADC was not represented. I'm told that they conducted some virtual meetings with stakeholders, but they were not there. They were not present physically. The African Union did not send an observer mission. They had what they called a technical expert mission, which was led by the former president of Nigeria, President Goodluck Jonathan. They did not even issue a statement. At the end, they said a statement would be issued by the African Union Commission chairperson. So I guess because this was the first election after COVID, many people, many groups were not there to observe. There were only 3 of us, African Union not being quite an observer mission, and then the East African Community and AISA. So I don't know if the East African Community feel that all was well. I'm not sure. I haven't seen whether the African Union Commission has issued any statement. I haven't seen any.
All right. And this constitutional point that you can't challenge an election result really kind of needs to be addressed by higher regional bodies, because that, I would put to you, really goes against the fabric of democracy.
Exactly, because it is only the presidential results that you can challenge once it has been announced and the results have been declared. You can't. So it means that is why you're not seeing, I haven't seen, maybe you have seen a statement. I've seen statements by the opposition, Chadema, and the other one, ACT Wazalendo. They were saying that they were going to organize protests. I don't know whether those protests materialized. It appears that some of them, allegations are that they have been, some of them have been arrested. But I haven't seen any talk of anyone going to court, precisely because the Constitution does not provide for that opportunity.